Salvete, sodales, cogitatores et potatores. Now, recently, I have been looking, I've produced a couple of videos discussing the various Deep Purple set lists and making my observations based thereon. In particular, taking a critical look, I think, at why they have remained so stagnant over the years. Now, having done that, my thoughts inevitably turned to one of my other favorite, well, two of my other favorite bands, but I don't think Rush really come in for this. I always thought they were quite good at freshening up their set lists over their career. But yeah, when it comes to Black Sabbath, I think they're equally guilty as are Deep Purple, if perhaps even more so. They, over their effective 50-year career, their set lists were far too stagnant. It doesn't matter what era we were talking about. There was some change, but it was an evolved change. And over their career, once they got new standards, a couple of them would become fixtures. But yeah, it wasn't. They were rarely, or too rarely, dug deeply into their own very rich back catalog. Now, when I did this for Deep Purple, I was very much focused and conscious of doing that on a specific period in time. That being, that being shortly after the reunion, or the second tour after the reunion, the House of Blue Light tour. As I said in that video, if they were going to make any sort of fundamental change, then that was probably when it was going to happen. As we now know, it didn't happen. Now, when discussing Black Sabbath, it's equally important to to frame this in a realistic time frame, section of their career. But in the Sabbath case, it's equally important to decide upon which of their many singers is going to undertake this little experiment. A simple process of elimination will suffice, however. Osbourne rules himself out, even setting aside nostalgia. He simply did not have the vocal ability, to render the material recorded by the other singers. Likewise, Ronnie James Dio is easily eliminated. Yes, he most certainly had the voice, had all the technical skills required, but there is ample evidence that his interpretation of some of Osbourne's material was questionable at best, and perhaps more tellingly, when he returned for the Dehumanizer album and tour, he absolutely refused to sing any Tony Martin era material. So I think he rather disqualifies himself, if for no other reason. He probably had his head a little bit too far up his arse to enter the spirit which this project would require. Ian Gillan had both the voice and the cooperative attitude, I think, but he only recorded one album with the band, which I will doubtless get around to discussing at some further point. And I don't think it'd be represented enough, really, for what I had in mind here. Likewise, Glenn Hughes can be discounted. The memory of those painfully awkward 5 dates he did with the band in the mid-'80s has sadly not yet faded. But then again, even a fit and focused Hughes is just simply not the right man for this job. Which leaves us with Tony Martin. And I have to say, the evidence is overwhelming. Not only could Tony Martin sing absolutely anything asked of him, he was more than prepared to do it. It speaks not only to the quality of his voice, but also his professionalism, and perhaps even more tellingly, lack of ego. Okay, so much for the who, now for the when. One could argue that the band with Tony Martin in it were at their peak, and he perhaps vocally very much at his peak on the 1990 tour in support of the Tear album. I would not dispute that statement. However, it is not the tour or the show, one of the shows I have gone for. One could also perhaps think, for the purposes of this video, or the idea behind it, that the 1994 Cross Purposes tour would have more suited to purpose for once they did actually take a little bit of a leap of faith, as it were, dropped standards such as War Pigs in Heaven and Hell, and did reintroduce some genuine deep cuts from the past. Unfortunately, however, Tony Martin was vocally not at his best on that tour. So no, I'm actually going for something from the Forbidden tour. Now, as with the Deep Purple set list, I did... Oh, set lists, I've discussed several, I know, but I did base it something, to some large degree on reality. Now, I've done the same here. I've taken a show from towards the very end of the Forbidden tour, November, maybe even December 1995 in Japan. I think, is it Nagoya or Tokyo? I never remember, but anyway. And Black Sabbath at this time consists of Tony Iommi, Tony Martin, Neil Murray, Jeff Nichols. Initially, Cozy Powell played on the tour, but by the time we get to this particular show, he had been replaced by Bobby Rondinelli. But I have to say, the band had rarely, if ever, and I include their entire 50-year career, played better than they had on this tour. And it's also, one has to remember the context. This was 1995. And it wasn't just a Black Sabbath, was it? But, I mean, they were just one of those bands that were, especially in the United States, where it's their commercial, in terms of popularity, had reached their nadir. And it wasn't just Black Sabbath that, when it came to touring, were being booked into the more spacious public conveniences that the US had to offer, and not necessarily selling them out. And this tour was Sabbath headlining with Motorhead, and I think, was it Metal Church or Morbid Angel, which one would have thought would have been a fairly decent night out in anybody's assessment, but no, they were playing embarrassingly small venues to occasionally even more embarrassingly small crowds. Which kind of supports the argument I'm about to make, or perhaps at least it should have done. If Black Sabbath were ever going to indulge in something this adventurous in terms of set list, then surely this was the moment. They had literally nothing to lose. But they didn't, and as promising as the Headless Cross Tour was in this regard, by the time the Forbidden touring cycle had started, Heaven and Hell and War Pigs and Iron Man were back in the set. However, this particular show is not only is it an amazing recording and an amazing performance, there is a lot of Tony Martin stuff included in it, which otherwise, one rarely heard. So I've been able to keep some of it, but no, I'll go through it, and, as it was. Okay, now, sticking to the original recording, they open with Ave Satani, which does everything you need it to do. It's the music from The Omen. I'm sure we've all heard it. The perfect mood setter for a Black Sabbath show. You can just visualize it. The lights go out, the dry ice coming across the stage. Had Christopher Lee appeared from behind the drum riser, it would have felt totally appropriate. It's really effective opening music. Now, on this tour, the band actually, and on this show, opened their set with Children of the Grave, which was the first time it had been a show opener since the first leg of the Born Again tour back in 1983. It's first time since then as an opener, but I don't think a tour, and a live event has gone by since the song was first recorded in 71 where it's not been played. I think we can give it a rest. And so, for this exercise, I've given it a rest. And I've replaced it with Symptom of the Universe. Now, they did play this on the Cross Purposes tour. And they did play it in its entirety with the jazzy coda that you find on the studio version. That was, at least when back in the 70s when they played it live, they never included. And I'll tell you what, is there really a better Black Sabbath concert opener than Symptom of the Universe? And Martin sang it extremely well. So for my set here, it's going to be Symptom of the Universe replacing Children of the Grave to get things underway. And yes, please, I would have hoped they would have continued to play it in full with the jazzy coda. Now, originally, in this concert, they went into Neon Nights, and again, it's a great song, but has it ever not been played when anybody other than Osborne was singing for the band? I don't think so. So we'll do something a little different here, and we'll exchange it for "Turn Up the Night," the opening song on the Mob Rules. Now, I freely admit that "Turn Up the Night" is just the Mob Rules attempt to recreate Neon Nights, and it is not quite as successful, but it is by no means does that make it a bad song. And for the purposes of including something different, we'll have it in the set. Okay, so that's that. We move on. Now they then played The Shining, which which was fairly much a Martin era standard, and it deserves its inclusion. We keep it. They then played The Wizard, which they had brought out of mothballs on the Cross Purposes tour, and it was a great rendition. Martin's excellent on it, and I'm happy to keep it. They then play Kiss of Death, which was one of the absolute highlights of the Forbidden album, and it's a song that really does get overlooked, not only in the Martin era of the band, but in terms of the band's entire catalogue. They didn't play it at the beginning of the tour. They were playing Guilty as Hell, one of easily the weaker tracks on Forbidden. But at some point, Sanity dawned, and they did replace it with Kiss of Death, and it absolutely deserves its inclusion here, and I'm keeping it. They then followed Headless Cross. Yes, the Martin era signature song has to be played. I'm keeping it. Rusty Angels up next. Another, more upbeat track from Forbidden. Not the best thing on the album, but it's got that energy to it that that makes it, an effective and attractive live piece. They included it. I'm happy to keep it. And then When Death Calls, one of the other Martin era signature songs, has to be played. Okay, and we started with a classic. Went to a deep cut. Now we've got most of the Martin stuff. Well, not most of it. Some of the Martin stuff out the way. Now, after When Death Calls, I'm actually inserting a song that they didn't play on this one, but it's a song called I Won't Cry For You, which featured on the Forbidden album. They played it once that I know of, on perhaps the very first date of the tour, because I have a recording of it, and my God, it sounded really good live, and I couldn't justify not including it here. It's not replacing anything. I'm just inserting it at this point. They then played Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, which I will keep. Again, that was returned on the Cross Purposes tour. What were they doing all that time? I mean, Dio could have sung it. Gillan could have sung it. For whatever reason, the rest of the band didn't want to. Martin sings it wonderfully. And the fact that this thing had been in mothballs for so long is incredibly frustrating. But they did bring it back here, and it is done in full. Okay? Then Can't Get Close Enough, which was another song from Forbidden. One of those things, it was perhaps not that great on the record, but it had much more presence live. And this is the Forbidden tour. Okay, they are promoting that album, so I perfectly justify in retaining it. Okay, now this is where they went back to the conservative self. Okay, they followed Can't Get Close Enough with War Pigs. Now, we've heard this enough. They did drop it on the previous tour, but no, it's back. I've gone for something a little left field here. I've gone for the Rit. Never performed live. An absolute monster of a song. But in Tony Martin, they had the guy who could deliver it. And that's one of those things, you'd kill to hear them do that. They never did. It never got anywhere near the stage, unfortunately. But it is one of the band's best ever compositions from the Sabotage album. Never even attempted live. All right. So in my world, at least, as far as this set's concerned, the Rit makes its debut. They followed it up with Mob Rules, which again has been done to death. It's a great song, but come on, let's try a little something. What then? Well, I've gone back to the Tony Martin era, and I've gone for Valhalla from Tyr. It's fast, it's aggressive, it's driving, it's committed. A lot of things that, the Mob Rules also is. Now, Valhalla was part of a suite on the album. So whether you're going to do the instrumental, the Battle of Tyr, then the acoustic but very haunting Odin's Court, and then into Valhalla, I haven't specified. It just occurred to me. I'd be happy for them to do that, but at the very least, this is a great song that, again, they never played it live. They played the instrumental, they played Odin's Court once, and only once, but they never made the transition into Valhalla. And it was never attempted on stage, which it's one of the most obvious live songs. So it gets its long-awaited debut here. Now, the band on the original show then played even Black Sabbath. Now, again, yes, okay, it's the eponymous song. Yes, we all know. But again, we've heard it. There are very few shows in the band's entire career where this was not featured. And, considering, when it was written, effectively their entire career, it was dropped, if memory serves, for part of the Volume 4 tour in 1972, but that was an exception. Now, if any song in their catalogue could in any way recreate the effect, the doom, the style of Black Sabbath, it would have to be the title track from The Eternal Idol. There are similarities. It's a very different song, but it's that slow menace to it. It's just very evocative of the song Black Sabbath, and again, was never attempted live. So, in the interests of freshening up the set list, the Eternal Idol would play Black Sabbath. Now, they closed their main part of their set with the Return of Heaven and Hell, which, as always, they expanded the middle section for some noodling and jamming. Now, I thought long and hard about this. And two things. I nearly went with Wheels of Confusion, because it's, as with Heaven and Hell, starts slowly, builds up to a faster finale, and it was, it's a long piece as it was, and you could have, taken the middle section and expanded it on stage as they did for Heaven and Hell. That would have worked quite nicely. And it was not played very often at all. My other choice, however, was Dirty Women, which conversely was played in the 70s for the Technical Ecstasy and the entirety of the Technical Ecstasy and the Never Say Die tour, and since they reformed with Osborne in 97, has been a fixture in the set. And it kind of perhaps goes against the principles of what I'm trying to achieve here. But bloody hell, it's a really good live song, and Iommi's soloing on it, I think, is excellent. So I've gone for Dirty Women instead of Heaven and Hell with an admission that it could easily have been Wheels of Confusion, but no, we'll stick with Dirty Women for now. Okay, now come encore time. They were Iron Man. Again, we've heard this one, so I will exchange Iron Man for the Sabbath Stones. It's another Martin era classic, and it is a classic in every sense of the word, from its construction, its performance, its scope, its vision, and that was played live in 1990, and it was an absolute monster on stage. And as I say, we've all heard Iron Man. Now, getting back to the original recording, they did have one huge surprise in store for the fans. They played changes, which I keep. I only have an audio recording of this, so I don't know if it was simply Jeff Nichols who played the piano parts or Iommi, or I really don't know. All I can say is that Tony Martin's vocals on this are incredible, and it must have been a huge surprise at the time. And even listening to it now, it is rather thrilling. So that gets kept. Now I'm inserting another song here because I think this album needs to be represented, and which in itself poses a challenge. The album I'm talking about is Born Again. No need to dwell on what the challenges of playing some of those songs would be. But I've gone for Keep It Warm. Why? Well, it's always been one of my favorites from the album. A huge riff, and it's a wonderful musical construction. And I can actually genuinely hear Tony Martin singing this one. I wouldn't want to torture him with Disturbing the Priest, particularly. I think he could do it, but and we've heard Disturbing the Priest live. They did play Keep It Warm on the first 5 or 6 dates of the Born Again tour, but no, much overlooked song. And again, I'm sure it would have had surprise value. All right, I'm going to have them do another encore, and I think Under the Sun is another classic from back in the day that's very underrepresented on stage, so we can throw that in. Another one I think Martin could sing. And they're going to have to finish with Paranoid, are they not? Would they ever get away with not playing it? Probably not. Could I do without it? Well, sitting here I could, but once you're there in the evening, you may have different feelings about it. So that's that. That would have been my fantasy set list, and under the conditions I described earlier, it would have had to have been Tony Martin to do it. And as I said, I think if they were going to do anything like that, then the Forbidden Tour, for the reasons given, were the time to do it. So just to recap, okay, we in Ave Satani, okay, Symptom of the Universe, Turn Up the Night, The Shining, The Wizard, Kiss of Death, Headless Cross, Rusty Angels, When Death Calls, I Won't Cry for You, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, Can't Get Close Enough, The Writ, Valhalla, The Eternal Idol, Dirty Women, The Sabbath Stones, Changes, Keep It Warm, Under the Sun, and Paranoid. Now, tastes may differ, shall we say, but I think that's a pretty good show. I don't. I also admit it's one that's very unlikely to have happened, but I think that would have been something different. I think if you'd been fortunate enough to see that, it's not one you'd have forgotten. Now, look, somewhere on the screen, this is the bootleg of the show, which I based this on. If you haven't heard it, I do most sincerely recommend you checking it out. This is a damn good show, without my alterations and amendments. It's called Forbidden Rules, at least my copy is. As I said, both in terms of performance and sound quality, really is quite exceptional. Again, I have to say, if only, as I mentioned when discussing similar things on the Deep Purple video, if only they had felt able to do something like this at the time. And it's not about privileging one era of the band over another, but it's just, it'd be nice to see them trusting the entire breadth of their own catalog. I am not wedded to any particular track. This is purely a suggestion of mine. This reflects choices, not doctrine. And what actually matters, I think, is the principle. Black Sabbath with one or two exceptions, across all incarnations over 50 years, defaulted far too often to that safe, well-established material, regardless of who was in the band and where or when the tour took place. And this conservatism was not era-dependent necessarily. It was habitual. Again, I say, once you have Osborne back in the band, anything that didn't feature him, we know, for practical as well as political reasons, we're never going to hear it again. But, well, what can I say? That's why I went for a Tony Martin era show, honest. But it is unfortunate because, again, this conservatism did deprive the audience of, a more accurate picture of the band's entire career. And did deprive us of some bloody good songs. Obviously, since they reunited with Osborne, his own limitations resulted in a very, very restricted set list. And, I got tired of going to the shows, seeing the same 8 or 10 songs being trotted out and paying through the nose for the privilege. Okay, at this point I'm going to do a shameless plug, but it's well within character. Now, a couple of years ago, I did commit the unforgivable sin of going into print about Black Sabbath, and on this occasion it was the Tony Martin era. So if you're interested in the Tony Martin era, then I do obviously recommend, available on Amazon, Echoes of a Forgotten Voice. It takes the entire Tony Martin era under the microscope and discusses its successes, its failures, the reasons it came into being, the problems that surrounded it, why it wasn't perhaps appreciated at the time, and how thankfully it seems to be now undergoing something of a resurgence. I claim no credit. But if you're interested in that, then that book is available on Amazon. And what was typical of the, not necessarily only of the Tony Martin era, but I say without one exception, of the Cross Purposes tour, generally very conservative set lists, and I do explore that in the book, why possibly they felt that they had to limit themselves to the tried and tested. But, my argument in the book, as it is now, having discussed this fictitious set list, or possible set list, the limitation was never the material itself. It was a limitation of imagination when it came to presenting it. Okay, well, please feel free to like, to share, to subscribe, and all those other good things. And obviously to comment. I'm sure some of you will have some thoughts on this one. And, as usual, until next time, I thank you very much for your indulgence, and mashonkia.